mind if I start standing and then I sit down after the introduction? Okay, okay. Then it will be up to you. I think if you're a panelist, you're absolutely free to. Can we start? Okay. Okay. Good afternoon, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Let me welcome you all to this afternoon session on policy measures for a just transition. My name is László Andor. I'm the Secretary General of FEPS, the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, which is a co-organizer of this panel, together with the European Institute of ULB, where I'm also a visiting professor, teaching courses on economic governance with my colleague David Ritandi, and also on international migrations, which is not less important, especially nowadays. But today we are focusing on the social dimension of climate change, where the European Union, in my view, is really playing a leading role, also internationally. I would even say globally. I think when you look back to the history of this policy field, about 7 years ago, we had in Paris a very important summit hosted by the then socialist government of France about climate policy. About 2009 was the Copenhagen summit, and you can go back in time again and again. 1972, Stockholm. The first environmental summit. European countries have been playing a very important role, and progressively the European Union itself started to play the role of coordination and also leadership. I would also highlight that 2019 probably is a turning point. And those who believe that elections do not have an impact on European policy should just look into the case of 2019 and how what we learned in the campaign about climate change and the affection of the young generation of voters to the question of environment and climate, this indeed helped to push climate to the top of the European policy agenda under the leadership of, as we know, the first Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans. Therefore, I should really thank Diederik Samson, who is the head of cabinet of Mr. Timmermans at the European Commission, to have accepted our invitation and to be a keynote speaker of this afternoon panel. But once I mentioned 2019, I should also highlight that for FEPS, our organization, which is the think tank of the progressive center-left political parties in the European bubble, 2019 was also very important here, because we organized a big conference in New York under the title United for Climate Justice. And it was indeed very important to connect these two policy fields. On the one hand, the capacity to tackle climate change, and on the other hand, to ensure that the way these policies are rolled out, the way we concentrate our resources for new investment is going to lead us to a fairer economic but also social system. And the long list of imbalances, potential asymmetries in society, including the global society, but also the generational dimension, were already pointed out in those times. I believe that our keynote speaker, as well as the panelists, will speak about the social dimension of the list of EU policies which we learned in the last 3 years, the Green Deal, the Just Transition Mechanism, Fit for 55, and more recently, the Social Climate Fund. These buzzwords might be familiar already for you, but we will learn a lot about the background and various implications. Let me just tell you, before Diederik begins, who the panelists will be. We are still waiting for Javi Lopez, a member of the European Parliament, to arrive, but I'm told that he's on his way. He's also the Environment, Climate Change and Energy Network Chair of the Party of the European Socialists. We have with us Stefany Lepczynski, who is a cabinet member of the State Secretary at the Brussels Capital Region, dealing with the economic transition and scientific research. And we have on my right Chiara Armeni, who is a professor at ULB, just one floor higher. And we have Félix Mayeux, who is an advisor on climate, energy and industrial policies at the ETUC. After the keynote speech, they will take the floor in this order. But first of all, I would like to ask Diderik Samson to present the topic and his ideas and the Commission policies on the subject of the day.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Happy to be here. Yes, I'm going to tell you the story of the Green Deal, which is a story of an environmental policy that survived the two biggest societal crises that you can imagine, a pandemic and a war. And that's quite unique, because normal environmental policy only needs a crisis, well, 1/10 of one of those two to be shelved in the lowest possible drawer that a politician can find. And that didn't happen to the Green Deal. And in order to explain you why it didn't happen to the Green Deal, I have to take you back to another era, which is the pre-COVID era, December 2019, when we presented the plan. The Green Deal stands out from normal environmental policies that you can receive dozens of per year from Brussels alone, in three ways. First of all, its ambition. For once, we didn't have to settle for the lowest common denominator, the normal landing strip in politics. No, this time, because of the era in which we were writing it, and Laszlo was already referring it, it was, you had those Fridays for Future movement, and it was that incredible time within the Commission that there is no commission between two mandates. We could write down what was needed. Pretty simple, you should say, but you end up with writing climate neutrality in 2050 because it's necessary. But not only that, also as a full stop to the loss of biodiversity before 2030. A full stop to the loss of biodiversity before 2030, because you cannot compare apples to oranges, so you shouldn't. But if you do, you could argue that the loss of biodiversity is a bigger threat to future generations than climate change. Again, don't compare apples to oranges, but still. But not only that, also full circularity by 2050 and a stop of all pollution of water, soil and air. We have polluted enough. Those four big ambitions in one plan. That was the second biggest difference between normal environmental policies, because normally you receive something on transport and then somewhat later on water and then on energy and then on housing and then on something else, and then you discover that all those environmental plans are not coherent. This time was different. We could write one plan and actually come to think of it, it's pretty logic. There's only one ecosystem. And in that ecosystem, everything is connected to everything else too, as we endured in the pandemic. And the third biggest difference between an environmental policy and the Green Deal is not an environmental policy. It's a growth strategy. It's an economic plan. It's an economic plan to provide an aging continent, because let's be honest, Europe is an aging continent. People are aging, houses are aging, our industry is aging. To provide that aging continent with new momentum, new impetus, new innovation, new energy. And I have a background in the environmental movement, so I know when presenting the Green Deal, I received some raised eyebrows by my former buddies, because how on earth can you combine those huge environmental ambitions with a growth strategy? I think we not only can, I do think we must. And I'm happy we did, because 3 months later, the world, and Europe included, crashed into the COVID crash. And after scrambling for PPEs and healthcare, and we had recuperated a little from the first shock, we sat down and thought, okay, what's next? What do we need now? Well, what do we need? A growth strategy to recover, literally to recover from the COVID crash. Well, that came in handy because we had just written one, a green one, which is the best way to build back, as we all know. So not only was the Green Deal not shelved, it was put on steroids, with 750 billion investments added to it to realize the Green Deal's objectives. The objectives didn't change, but obviously the means to reach them became bigger. So what's now the biggest challenge of the Green Deal? Is it technology, all those solar panels, all those windmills, all those electrical cars, all the electrolyzers for the hydrogen? Well, that is a challenge, yes, true. Is it finance? Hundreds, no, thousands of billions of euros needed to make this happen. Quite a lot of money, big challenge. But they are dwarfed by the biggest challenge of all, which is the mother of all political challenges, redistribution. How on earth can you make such a big transformation while keeping society together? Because let's be honest, every industrial revolution, and this is one, again, the biggest maybe in history, every industrial revolution is Darwinistic in its nature. It always ends up with more money and more power in the hands of fewer people. The first industrial revolution, the invention of the steam engine, is maybe the best or the worst example of that. It created the social movement, it created social democracy, it created labor unions in order to repair the damage. By the way, repairing the damage using the enormous benefits of the Industrial Revolution, which is a tripling in wealth. The first did triple our wealth, the second again, and the third again. And now we are into the fourth. Some people say the fifth, but that's a bit arbitrary. And this one is bigger than ever. And this time we cannot afford to make the transition and repair the damage afterwards, simply because our democracies are too mature. Rightly so. People do demand justice, and they don't want to wait a generation for that justice to happen. And the second biggest difference, big difference with the first three industrial revolutions is this one will not triple our wealth. It won't. We are already incredibly rich. So we need to have we need to use the means that we have. There's no if you have a bigger cake, it's easier to divide it. But the cake is staying as big as it is, and we have to divide it better than we did so far. That is our biggest challenge. So in an environment that people are not willing, rightfully so, to wait and see, in an environment where there's not much more wealth to be divided, we need to redistribute this, our wealth and within this transition. And the story gets better or worse, whatever, depending on how you look at it. Because now, Corona, as I said, put the Green Deal on steroids. So we have these ambitions, climate neutrality in 2050, so that translates into 55% CO2 reductions in 2030, etc. You all know the drill. And then, on the 24th of February, Putin invades Ukraine and wakes up Europe from what you could say is 4 decades of sleepwalking into a very bad situation. Overdependence on fossil fuels, the bedrock of our wealth, from one supplier, one only. That happened for 40 years, and willing and knowingly, we all did it. There were a few people crying wolf or warning, but no, the mainstream thought, well, easy, comfortable, cheap, energy from Russia, yeah, well, why? Is that a problem? Well, we all know the answer right now. That is a problem, and we need to get out of it quickly. And that requires an additional effort. So first putting the Green Deal on steroids and now supercharging it into an even faster transition than we had already envisaged, even faster. We calculated we did the numbers, and if you want to get rid of 150 billion cubic meters of gas, because that's what we import from Russia every year, 150 billion cubic meters, which is 150 billion cubic kilometers. If you want to imagine how much gas that is. So you have to walk a kilometer that way, a kilometer to the right, and then one up. And that's the block filled with gas, and that times 150. That's what we import from Russia. That's an incredible amount of energy. If you want to replace that, obviously you're going to get it from somewhere else. That's where geopolitics gets quite hypocritical, because we get it from Saudi Arabia, which is a country that already bombs another country for 10 years, and we don't seem to care. Life is ugly. Geopolitics is really ugly. But okay, if we have that, 1/3 of that, we need to still replace 2/3 of it with different means, which is renewable energy and energy saving. And just to give you a few numbers on how big the effort is, on top of what we wanted to do to save the climate, to get more energy security, we need to put an additional 200 gigawatts of renewable capacity into the field, literally, solar and wind. 200 gigawatts of extra capacity before 2030, and preferably before 2027, because we want to be quick. If you translate that into solar panels, it's 2,000 square kilometers of solar panels to be added to what was already planned. And we need to save an extra 1,500 petajoules of energy, which is the energy consumption of Austria. So within 5 years, we save Austria in terms of energy. And we need to add that to what we were already planning. How on earth can you design such a policy and make it just? Because that's in the end, as I said, the main challenge. That challenge just grew bigger in the last 10 minutes, and very much so. The way we designed the package is create as much redistributional elements within the package as possible. So it's actually the heart of politics. You tax and you redistribute. So you ask money from people who can afford it, and then you redistribute it to people who cannot. And you need as much as possible from that, which is obviously a challenge because it implies raising energy prices. And now the argument is going around in the street saying, hey, guy, energy is already getting very expensive. How on earth can you top that up with even more? Well, there's a very big difference between the price increase that we see right now and the price increase that we envisage within the Green Deal, within Fit for 55, within Repower EU, because that's now the new name of the game. The first price increase is handing money to third countries, notably Putin, by the way, sponsoring his war. The second price increase, the one we design, is handing money to ourselves, making our world a little better. Because you could argue that redistributing wealth, enabling everybody to make a living, to make everything out of their lives, is making this a better world. Not more wealthy in terms of gross national product, but more wealthy in terms of equality. So what we do is we try and create this redistribution and make it as big as possible, which is the biggest political problem for government leaders, obviously, because they have to explain to their public, listen, we have this incredible plan. We will all end up in a better place. By the way, pay more for your energy today in an environment where energy is already very expensive. So do not underestimate the political challenge of this. But if we have enough political will to do it, if we have the bold politicians that sometimes arise in Europe, not always, but sometimes they do, I do think we can make this, because everybody agrees on the objective. I think most of us agree on the pathway, which is via renewables, via energy saving, via a just transition, so redistributional means. And if we agree on those two issues, the objective and the pathway, we should be able to agree on the measures, on the policies. But time will tell. Because in the next month, government leaders will discuss Repower EU, which is the supercharged version of the Fit for 55, while not having agreed on Fit for 55 itself. So we create this political dilemma of asking our leaders of government to agree on the 11th floor of a building, while still having to agree on the first 10 floors, which is Fit for 55 itself. And you don't have much use of an 11th floor when the first 10 are not built. And they obviously know that, all smart people, so we know what is at stake. I hope that our design is fit for purpose, And I hope that in these times that we all agree are very challenging times, we can find enough political courage to make this happen. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to hand over to the panel.
Thank you very much.
No, I can do 2 or 3. I have 5 minutes left.
Yes, exactly. Diederik kindly saved a couple of minutes from the speaking time. Unfortunately, afterwards, he will have to return to his office. But if there is one or maybe 2 quick questions, he kindly agreed to answer. Yes, the first one over there. Maybe you can come for a microphone and then ensure that is there a roving mic? Over there.
Thank you. In English or French?
English.
Okay. Thank you for this presentation. I asked myself about the just transition policies you've put in place in Europe, who are mainly for East country dependent of coal industries, and what's about like the next step of just transition for mainly West countries and I don't know, like poor people here in, by example, in Belgium, who are not dependent of coal industries but still need just transition policies.
Yeah, we have both actually addressed. So we have the Just Transition Fund, which emerged at the beginning of the Green Deal, which is designed to help regions with a bigger carbon economy and therefore a bigger challenge to decarbonize. Poland always comes to mind, but there's much more than that around Europe. So that's what the Just Transition Fund is for. But the Social Climate Fund is for everyone in Europe. 500 million European citizens can profit from that. And the mechanism is pretty simple. As I said, we will increase prices on energy using the emission trading system. Not going to go into the details, most of you will know them. But in short, we will increase the collective energy bill of Europeans with 40 billion euros per year. The collective energy bill paid by all of us is increased by 40 billion. That 40 billion is transferred into public hands, it's public money, and redistributed so that everybody is able to pay that bill. Because let's face it, all our energy bills will increase. Most of it, for most of us in Europe, that will be annoying, but pretty doable. Let's assume 20% of people, which is already a big estimate, but let's assume the 20% poorest households in Europe. By the way, they do not pay 20% of the energy bill. They only pay 9% of the energy bill because they use much less energy than rich people. So 9% of the energy bill needs to be compensated. Out of that 40 billion, we will take half. So we will take 50% of that money in order to redistribute it. While 9% needs to be compensated. I know from experience that politicians and policies are pretty dumb, or you could say stupid in terms of handing exactly the amount of money to exactly the right kitchen table. That will never happen. But even if you do this incredibly stupid, it must be possible to compensate 9% of the energy bill using 50% of the money. So we have the means. But obviously, it requires us to explain to all the other people who are not compensated, swallow it. It's a higher energy bill, sorry. And there's not much fun in that, and there's not much electability in that either. We all know, and the French know that, I think most prominently, because you tried with only 3 cents on a liter of diesel. So it's quite a hard, I do not underestimate the political challenge that we have just put on the table.
Okay, perhaps the last question from Professor Tello, and let's allow Javi Lopez to take his seat. And we welcome you, Javi. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for this very important and outstanding synthetic presentation of a huge issue. I will combining the environmental, digital, and growth strategy. This all was an historical step, but was implemented within the current treaty context. We see that there are problems. Ursula was in Budapest yesterday because the link between the recovery and the rule of law and also the sanctions issue. My question is, do you agree about the need asserted by Macron of a reform of the treaty in Strasbourg 3 days ago? And if yes, which will be the measures you think necessary to improve the historical change advanced by the European Commission and institutions by the recovery? Thank you so much.
The simple answer is we don't need any treaty change to make the Green Deal happen. So that's, you could also say, a comfortable answer, because treaty change will take longer than the Green Deal deadline of 2030. So I'm happy to be able to give this answer. And that's because our predecessors were smart enough to design climate and environmental policy into the treaties as they are, with quality majority voting, etc. Obviously, you're right. The bigger challenge behind the Green Deal, as I say, it's about social economical policy, and that's where unanimity comes in play. I'm not afraid of that. We are in the Commission, we are confident that we can win the hearts and minds of the people, but also of the government leaders, in order to go along with this. We don't need to outvote anybody. Not Orban, not anybody else. I do think in the end that we will have the political momentum to make this happen. Orban is a good example, by the way, because he's always painted as the bad guy who will veto everything that comes to his mind. But he told Ursula von der Leyen last week that indeed he hates a lot in environmental policies that we design, and he has the right to do so, although I disagree. But he is embarking on an energy transition. You could say the Hungarian version of it, all nukes and solar. But okay, it's out of fossil fuels, it's out of CO2 emissions, it's out of over-dependence from Russia. So he himself is on a pathway which is much more aligned than we might think. The same is happening in Poland, which is always pictured as that country that is only burning coal and doing nothing else. The biggest investments at the moment made by the EIB, and we check their numbers every month, in terms of where they invest in renewable technology, it's Poland. The biggest amounts of money going from the EIB to member states is to Poland. And before I entered into this incredible job in the Commission, I worked in the private sector for 2 years, playing around, and I worked for venture capital that was looking for opportunities to invest in renewable technology. So I traveled around Europe, and you know where I came up? In Eastern Europe, in Poland, where they work on perovskite, which is the magical solution for the next generation of solar cells. Or in sheds in Prague or in Budapest, where young people, technically educated, more than in Western Europe, in a more dynamic economic environment, higher growth figures than in Western Europe, with a younger population than Italy and Germany, etc., are making a change. So the let's say, cliché picture of Eastern Europe not wanting to move along and Western Europe doing all the work, it requires some reassessment. If you look at Germany, you might think, well, that is an economy that is difficult to change course, while the economies of Romania, they are at the moment, indeed, okay, they are more carbonized at the moment, but they're changing faster. So I'm optimistic about the ability of Europe as a whole to make this happen. With that, I'm going to leave you.
You couldn't be more reassuring. That was really great at the end. Also, what you said about Hungary. Let me give you this gift, because this is a FEPS publication about the circular economy.
Thank you.
And I believe a lot of good readings, and we obviously continue with publications.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming, and we count on you also in the future. And indeed, we welcome Javi. Thank you so much. I already announced your arrival, but do you want to speak now? You would take a rest and listen to the other speakers, and you speak at the end. What do you think?
Okay, I don't care. As you prefer. I can listen my colleagues and then.
Fantastic. Why don't we, in this case, start with Chiara, who has a little presentation, it's not a long one, and then continue with Stephanie and Felix, and then Javi will sum up, and then we open up for the discussion as normal. Is that fine for everybody? Very good. Thank you. Yeah, mic is absolutely vital because we have the viewers online.
Thank you very much. It's not even a presentation, it's just a pinpointing. Yes. So, I'm a legal scholar, and I've been working on public participation in environmental decision making for several years. So my reflection as an opening statement come from this perspective. So I suggest that we go back to basics and we go back to main concepts and processes. So my 3 points for today, as you can see on the slides, are first of all to address some concept of inequalities and the multiple dimensions of justice. And I will talk a little bit more about these elements. Secondly, I will discuss the need for public participation. Probably is very early in the discussion with my colleagues, but I will also acknowledge some of the challenges. And as a lawyer, we like justice talk, so I'll go back to the role of law. So let me start with justice and inequalities. Inequalities and climate change are linked in a double knot, and climate change and its policy responses generate inequalities. And we know it from many elements of the just transition. Decarbonization will lead to sacrifices in the fossil fuel industry, loss of jobs. We can look at carbon taxes that can be regressive. We can look at energy efficiency standards in buildings and the effects on housing and affordability. And we can look at subsidies for renewables. There's a long list. So I won't go into the laundry list, if you like, but it's pretty clear that policymakers are increasingly confronted with the dilemmas of justice when it comes to their climate decisions. And the deepest the inequalities, the slowest and more complex the transition will be. And that's something else that we know. So this potentially sends us back into a vicious circle. And climate policies could also amplify existing inequalities. And this might result in what Deborah Hellman describes as a process of compounding injustices. And this is a process when those on the losing end of inequalities in resources and status are also socially isolated. So this leads us to the need to go beyond the focus on redistribution, I suggest, to include intersecting inequalities, gender differences, inequalities in voice and representation, in access to good environmental policy and quality, and inequalities in age and background. And so all this is also linked to the idea of vulnerabilities and capabilities, who are also embedded in the cultural, historical context and are shaped by the social fabric and people's relationship with their environment despite technical assessment. So in addressing inequalities that arise from climate action, the justice discourse is increasingly mobilized, and that's what we've heard today. But we have lots of experience in this. We have experience from the energy justice, the climate justice, and more recently, the energy justice movement and literature. So what I'm interested in is the approach to justice that we can find in the Green Deal, or more specifically, in the EU Just Transition. And I think it's become very clear that what the EU is following is primarily a distributive approach to justice through a series of financing mechanisms for regions and sectors that will be exposed to the highest challenges. And this approach accepts that costs and benefits of climate policies are not fairly shared across demographic and geographic spectrums, and that measures must be put in place. And of course, this is necessary. We've heard all the reasons why this is necessary internally and for a geopolitical perspective. And but it is also important to recognize that focusing on distribution has a potential risk and it could be fragile from a justice perspective. And as Iris Marion Young says, the focus on distribution of material goods and resources inappropriately restricts the scope of justice because it fails to bring social structure and institutional contexts under evaluation. And that's something that triggers these other two elements of justice that I would love to focus on. So one way of going beyond the distributional framework and a way of taking social structures and institutional context into account is to focus on recognition. And here what we're interested in are the reasons for injustices and inequalities. In a way, this recognizes that the misdistribution also talks about marginalization, talks about alienation of people, frustration of communities. And I think this is something that we might bear in mind. And if you take, for example, wind farms in many member states, and the public opposition to wind farms, that starts from a sense of victimization and marginalization of a community that is affected by the impact of a project, even though funding and community benefits might be on the table. So here you have already the distributional element, but there's something more to bear in mind. And now the third element that is very dear to me is the procedural angle of justice, or justice as participation. And here participation plays a connecting role between the distributional angle, which is, as I said, important but potentially limited, and the recognitional angle. And participation here is an element and a condition for social justice. Which takes me to my second point about the need for a serious understanding and serious consideration of public participation for a process that tackles inequalities within the just transition. And of course, participation is not easy, and it could exacerbate inequality. Some well-known barriers are already well known. There will be issues with time, access to resources, expertise, inequalities in power between the participants. So all that we know. But even if participation fails to meet the democratic ideals, and environmental protection is still a fundamental part of a democratic decision-making process. And this is a substantive value that brings marginalized concern into the decisions. And this is important for a just transition perspective. Take the youth, for example. Involving the youth in territorial just transition plans is really important. And yet, there's research conducted at member state level that the youth have not been sufficiently involved in many of the preparation of territorial plans for accessing just transition funding. So participation is necessary because we have a legal right to participate in decision-making processes when it touches on environmental field. But it's also essential to complement the technical expertise that institutions and member states and actors are putting on the table. In the climate change context and in a just transition context, we're not only dealing with technical processes, we're dealing with value-driven processes. And so we need to know which actors are doing the politics, if you like, and which values are guiding our decisions. So participation is not a veto right. Participation could cut both ways. It could prevent ambitious action in some ways to protect jobs, or it could lead us to more ambition and more strategic and transformative decisions. Which takes me to my final point, that building on this, and as a lawyer, I think the role of law could potentially help here and could strengthen our approach. So law can be a barrier or an enabler in this sense. And I argue that in a just transition, we should focusing on the good points and good values that law can bring. For example, law could shape the process to offer a broader access and broader scope to be heard and influence the way inequalities will be tackled in the climate policies. Law can provide for extended and dedicated time for learning and for exchanging of views at all levels of governance. It can define who is included in the process by making space not only for identified stakeholders, as in some ways we find in the Just Transition Fund regulation, but for a wider set of participants, women, the youth, students, local authorities, or perhaps simply anyone who wants to engage in decisions about this transition. A legal obligation can also be used to justify decisions and to use participatory results into account in a very concrete and fundamental way. So to conclude, 3 points, 3 conclusions. So I suggest that a broad understanding of inequalities is increasingly salient in climate policies, and that a just transition should go beyond the redistributive framework. And finally, as I said, participatory processes could help with these 2 points, and the role of law could be strengthened. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much also for being attentive to the time. Let me then ask Stephanie to continue also within about a 10-minute time frame.
Thank you. So, hi everyone. I'll start with an illustration, perhaps a basic one, but still some important one. Take biofood. It's a good which is environmentally friendly because it's grown without pesticides, and that food also respects the dignity of the farmers that has produced it. So because she or he ask for fair retribution for their work. Second illustration, slow fashion. The clothing are usually locally designed. Used fabrics are also used to produce them, to upcycle some clothing, and this all process reduces the environmental footprint of the textile industry. And at the same time, for the designers, the upcyclers, the recyclers, they ask also a fair retribution for their work, for their art. So when you think about these basic needs that we have, which are eating and getting dressed, biofood and slow fashion are probably the most desirable options in their categories for the people and for the planets. But let's face it, if you compare biofood and slow fashion with their counterparts stemming from traditional economic models, i.e., let's call it fast food and fast fashion, so these are much more expensive because biofood and slow fashion, they internalize what others would call negative externalities, i.e. the environment and the social aspects. Problem is, if they are more expensive, it means that, of course, people with less resources cannot afford it. So this is really basic, as I said at the beginning, but I think it deserves to be stressed because fundamentally it shows that inequalities are at the core of what prevents us from being ambitious, quick, and efficient with climate transition. It prevents us, progressive people, to move fast and to be bold because our great concern is to make sure that no one is left behind in this transition. We could not just declare, for instance, that we'll put a taxation on fossil fuel for everyone uniformly, because we know that it would hurt more badly people who can't afford to go for work with their car, because there is no alternative for a train in the place where they live. So we can just apply this kind of measure. So as I said, it would be very efficient from a climate perspective, but it would not be efficient from a social justice perspective. Now, if inequalities is, and I mean economic equalities, because I represent a minister for the economy. So if these equalities are at the center of our concerns, we need to think about an alternative economic model that values social rights and doesn't presume that the pollution or the CO2 emissions induced by these goods or services have no impact on our environment. So having this alternative economic model in mind, in the Brussels capital region with State Secretary Barbara Tracht, we decided to experiment with an economic theory that precisely addresses the issue of inequalities and the protection of the environment at the same time. This theory is called the donut economics. It was conceptualized by an Oxford economist called Kate Raworth. The donut economics theory assumes that in a limited planet, in a limited system, as the planet Earth system, an economy cannot grow indefinitely, but should thrive within a certain space. This space could be materialized by two concentric circles forming the shape of a donut, the pastry. So the external circle represents the environmental boundaries of planet Earth. So you take fresh water or ozone levels or CO2 emissions levels. The inner circle represents the basic social rights that every human being should be entitled to. Take access to education, access to security, culture, political representation. A sound and prosperous economy should not be meant to grow forever, but to actually develop and unfold within these two circles. These two circles represents the ecologically safe and socially just space within which a thriving economy should develop. So in 2020, unfortunately it was during the first lockdown, a team made of researchers from business school here in Brussels, ISHEC, Confluence, which is an ASBL or an organization specialized in co-creation methodologies, and Kate Raworth herself. They worked with the regional administrations, with businesses, with the citizens, to actually understand that it was a research project, how we can downscale that concept of a donut, the donut theory, which is again made for the global system, how we could downscale it to the level of a region as Brussels. And so we designed that. We designed with this research project. We design what's called the Brussels Donut Portrait, which shows really where Brussels stands in terms of environmental boundaries. So no suspense, we explode or we overshoot our our planet boundaries, and also where we stand on the social rights. And it was done in a very participatory way, so more than 200 people participated in this research, and that was very interesting to see that actually we thought as a region from the global north we would of course overshoot on the environmental side, but we would be quite good on the social level. But actually when you ask the people what they think, this is not as good as we would presume. And we were, for example, very surprised to see that on the educational level, we thought, okay, like you are here at one very famous university. There are many in the Brussels territory, but actually people are asking for more. So that was one of the things we learned with this theory. What is important as well is that we just didn't draw our donut portraits. We also made tools which are available under common Creative Commons licenses. And these are methodologies for public administrations, for example, that want to design public policy strategies within the framework of the donut. So even if they are economic administrations like we are in charge of, they should not just think client-oriented. They should also design in their economic policies, take into account the environmental and social aspects. We also design the same tools for the enterprises, the businesses in the region, because this is also important for them to think and reflect on what's their what they bring to society and to the environment. Are they redistributive? Are they regenerative? These are two core principles of the donut theory. And thirdly, the Brussels Donut team also created tools for citizens, men and women from the streets that want to actually better understand that model. And as I said, there was a very participatory experience, and I think this is what's really needed. That as many people, as many organizations, associations, social partners, civil society use that model so that we get to the critical mass that will then make a real change to really take into account in economic policies, but in every policies, these very true, importantly, policies which are social and environment. And maybe to finish on a European note, I would just say that we had a very, very good presentation from Mr. Sampson before. The Commission is really right to push for the Green Deal and for the just transition and for the social climate funds, but it needs to go one step further and acknowledge that the two go together and they can be treated separately. Just as one could see in the donut, that the donut really has that 360 degrees view and nothing can stay out. You have the SDGs, for example, and you can pick up and cherry pick one of the SDGs and to say, okay, I'm good on this, but I'm not good on that. With the donut, this is not possible. You have that really 360 degrees perspective. And I think at DG Research, for example, they are experimenting with the donuts. I think this is really good. But I think the next step for the next Commission already, this is to really stop thinking about sustainable growth, but is to think about economic, social, environmental, and economic prosperity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I will try to react to some of the presentations that were made. Excellent, actually. And I will try also to bring a reality check also to what Mr. Diederik Samson has said, because every time I listen to him, I'm absolutely convinced and optimistic, and then I go back to my notes, and I think that there are some problems, but I will go back to that. There are different types of inequalities that interact with the climate crisis and climate policies. First is, of course, the inequalities when facing the climate change consequences. And here, I think we should start with that because vulnerable people will be the most impacted by these changes. And therefore, it's a no-brainer that we need to act, and we need to act strong. So I think we should always start with this. And then when since we need to act, we need to adopt climate policies, and here that leads to different sort of inequalities as well. First of all, inequalities between regions, because we know that the phase out of coal and the massive transformation of energy-intensive sectors, such as steel, aluminium, cement, etc., will have massive consequences for communities and for some regions, most of them located in Eastern European countries, but not only. And by the way, it's the same for the automotive sector, which will undertake massive transformation. In parallel, we know that new jobs are expected to be created in new sectors, renewables, green hydrogen, circular economy, all of this. But again, there is a risk that those new jobs will appear in the regions that have already good infrastructure, high investment capacity, and a skilled workforce. So this could reinforce existing inequalities. And if overall climate policies are expected to create more jobs than what they will destroy, clearly the impact will be differentiated between regions, and therefore we need to pay attention to that. Also, the quality, it's not yet guaranteed that the quality of the new jobs created will be the same than the one that will be lost. And I speak as a trade unionist. We know that those traditional sectors are usually highly unionized, and therefore they negotiated high wages and good collective bargaining agreement. It's not the same when we talk about renewable sectors yet. We know, for example, in the automotive industry, Tesla is planning to bring a factory in Berlin, but we know the union busting strategy of Tesla, so there are some doubts about that. So this is for the inequalities between regions. And of course, there are also inequalities between people that climate policies can reinforce. We mentioned a few of them. Let me focus on the financial inequalities that go with climate policies, because we know that climate policies have strong regressive distributional effects. This is the case, for example, of environmental VAT, carbon pricing, but also other types of policies, like the standards for car. It tends to make the car more expensive. It was badly designed, so the cars get bigger and less affordable. So here the problem that was, the solution that was put forward by the Commission is to create the Social Climate Fund in order to compensate the effects of the emission trading system on road transport and building. But here I tend to disagree with Mr. Sampson when he puts it as a solution to actually improve the distributional effects, because as he said, only 50% of the fund will be redirected. It may be sufficient to compensate the very low income households, but it will not be sufficient to compensate the middle class, for example, and this could fuel also populism in Europe. While on the other spectrum, the very rich households will be the one that will be able to quickly switch to electric vehicles or to renovate their houses, and in the end, they will not pay this carbon price. So I think in terms of redistribution, there are some problems as well. And when it comes to regions, the Just Transition Fund that was mentioned is a very positive step. But however, when we look at the amount that is budgeted, we talk about 19 billion euros. Just for a comparison, Germany budgeted 40 billion euros to compensate the coal region, the German coal regions only. So it puts a little bit into perspective the narrative of the Commission here. I won't go into I would love to talk about inequalities about skills, gender, race, etc. Maybe we can tackle that after, but I won't go too much into detail now. I will conclude by highlighting the need for an inclusive governance as well, and here I fully agree with you. Because if we want to get the sufficient social acceptance, recognition of people, the involvement of trade unions and civil society in general and the people that are most affected is particularly important. And of course, I preach for my chapel. I don't know if I can say that in English. But when it comes to labor aspect, working conditions, of course, trade unions should be at the table and not on the menu. And therefore, we would like to have collective bargaining and social dialogue. Thanks. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. And now, Javi Lopez, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It was extremely interesting to listen to your presentations, and I'm happy to share this table. I thought that it was useful to present some boxes of ideas that are interconnected. Okay, trying to talk about our climate policy and especially the distributional effects of our climate policy. Well, first, decarbonize. What it means, decarbonize, it means basically change four things of our socioeconomic life. It's industry, buildings, infrastructures, energy, forms of energy, and transport. And these four pillars, are basically what we are dealing with. Well, basically it's try to have a massive change of pillars of our socioeconomic life, no? Transport, energy, buildings, industry. Secondly, inequalities, it was well explained. we have currently a problem with inequalities. The level that we are having of inequalities now are damaging our economy, are socially or ethical unacceptable, I would say. And third, we saw during the last decade a lot of institutional and electoral disruption that are coming, one of the reasons from the inequalities. And we know this. We know that climate change has distributional effects, different distributional, unequal distributional effects, like it's affecting inequality. And at the same time, the reality is that the policies that we have against climate change, if are not designed properly, will have distributional effects. And could impact in our inequalities. Why? Because we have cost of transitions, of this massive change of these 4 pillars that will not be equal to everybody. No? And we are trying to deal with, and we are trying to think what kind of tools we need to compensate. Third, Europe. Well, we are doing all this mess here in Brussels, in the EU, that it's the climate policy, or all the leading the decarbonization of a huge economy. 3 elements that I think are important. It's, well, thanks God that we have the EU, because it's doing this here, like as a whole, as a continent, is the only way to do it efficiently. Secondly, because obviously in terms of competition between member states and the incentives of free riders, if all the national states would start to do this kind of legislation, it will be, well, a problem. And the third element, and I will share it with you, and I think this is something that here the European institutions that they are dealing with this, they should try to be aware. Is like, I think honestly that it will be politically impossible to pass all the green legislation in 27 member states. Politically. Like in terms of political confrontation, for it will be used for all the positions, and one of the main reasons that it will be impossible to pass all this legislation, like the package, 55 package, it's okay, the oppositions will use it, and so on. Okay, well, this says a lot of, like, this says some good things about Europe. I'm not sure if another good things about Europe. To be honest, because we are doing this because we don't have probably like the public pressure that we have in national parliaments. And for this reason, we are able to do this, that we have to do it. But we should be aware of that. If we will have the focus in the of the public opinion that national debates has, well, I'm not sure if we could pass part of the legislation that we are preparing, and I'm working for. But for this reason, the part of the participation is so important, because, like, if you are doing this and you are, like, if you are aware that only because you are doing this with consensual, technical, and some dark zones, you are able to, you should try to avoid problems in the future with this. Third, tools. What kind of tools we are using? Basically, it's like we are using 2 kinds of tools, no, to move the decarbonization. It's targeting, that it's the easiest part. Okay, this 50%, this 20%, this 60%. It's extremely easy to do targeting, years and targeting, and sectors. And secondly, market-based tools. 2 kinds of market-based tools. First, the creation of new markets, the artificial markets, that we have the experience, especially with the ETS, that could be useful. No? Markets provide some really useful things. It's like creates mechanism of incentives and disincentives, and at the same time provide something that is useful, that it's the price. Are a political construction, always. It's a political construction, a market, but could be useful, no? Creation and like enlarge the greenhouse emissions markets, first. Secondly, use the current market and the logics of the current market of consumers. How? Like adding to the prices, the negative environmental externalities of the products. Okay? And then if we add to all the prices the forces of the market will push to more products without environmental negative externalities. It's correct, and I think it's correct that we use these two kinds of tools. Are problematic these two kinds of tools in terms of distribution? Yes, a lot. And then we should try to think about this. About targeting. Targeting, it's easy. The problem of targeting is targeting goes hand by hand with investment and public investment. Targeting without public investment, it's nothing. We are extremely lucky that we have something called Next Generation EU, that it was not in the plan of the European Green Deal, I would say, that brings us the opportunity to move public investment to be possible, the targeting that we thought that it was our idea. To have a massive change of our transport, our energy funds, or something. New targeting should be like new investments. I will be clear about this. Like now, for example, the Commission is thinking about the possibility to grow the target of renewables for 2030. The idea was, probably 40%. Currently, it's 20%. To have a new target of 45% because the war, Ukraine, Russia, and so on. It's true, it makes sense. But if you want a new target, put more money. Public money. And then this is my point. Secondly, about the markets. The creation of markets and the use of market as a tool for mobilize and decide about the greenhouse emissions. I think it's correct, but always markets can face disruptions or booming, speculation, this kind of things happens in the markets. Then you need tools to avoid this kind of scenarios. Because we saw it with the energy market, could happen with the greenhouse market. And this is something that the Commission and the EU should have enough tools to control a market that is a useful tool, but with these limits. Secondly, the general consumer markets and these externalities that we have, this adding the price, cost of the negative externalities and so on, it makes completely sense. But it has been mentioned, the problem with the markets is the idea of the markets is all the elements are the same, no? And obviously all the elements, all the actors in a market are not the same because all they don't have the same resources, then they don't have the same capacity to adapt. Well, theoretically, the problem is basically if you add this cost of environmental cost to the products, to everything, the energy, to the buildings, to everything, the marginalized cost, it's not the same because it depends the level of income of the consumer. And then you have to deal with this. We saw a list of problems with the tools that we are using. How to, and the main risk, 1 minute, okay. The main risk, well, the main risk, in my view, it will be green nepotism and eco backlash. Okay, this will be the idea. And the atmosphere that we have and the institutional framework that we have in Brussels, that they love it. But it's easy to go to this idea of, okay, horizontal policies, without engaging enough with administrations, sectors, and nations, classes, social groups. And then it's extremely important that we engage with all of them and we co-decide with all of them to try to avoid this eco-backlash that could happen like in the medium term, and like the distributional effects of the policies, the main reason. No, I would say like really fast, like low-income households. We need a mechanism of compensations. We need mechanism of compensations to think about inflation. Inflation, this is something that will push the Green Deal. And like, and sorry, like to deny, it's not honest, because it's part of the plan to add the environmental cost to the products. Market control tools, especially to the like artificial markets that we are constructing, global measures, reskilling jobs, and protecting vulnerable companies. It's a long list of things that we can do, but trying to think about the problems that our tools, that are the correct tools, but the tools will create.
Thank you so much. I think we made a full circle. We started with the European Commission. We ended with the European Parliament perspective after discovering various dimensions of the topic. Now we have time, and I believe there will be questions from the room and questions also online. Why don't we collect a couple of questions in the room first, and then we check what questions arrived online. In the room, raise your hand if you have a question, otherwise we go online immediately. Shall we go online? Would you like to read a couple of questions from the stratosphere?
Exactly. So our audience on YouTube has a few questions. I have from Kevin Lemerle. Do you not believe some climate policies could be designed to have direct and positive redistributive effects without needing post-facto redistribution? This is one.
We need at least one person capable of answering each question.
Okay, perfect. I have a second question from Regina Dimitrisina. What is the future of the European Social Climate Fund now that a compromise in the Parliament has been reached and private households have been excluded by 2029? And I have a final one from Pedro Mendez. Why do our bills need to increase when Shell has record profits? We want to talk about a just transition, but how can it happen if we allow polluters to keep, even upgrade their profits? Okay. That's so far very varied.
Okay, perhaps Felix can start. You had the first.
Yes, excellent questions. To Kevin, I would say that climate policies are not designed and shouldn't be designed really to be progressive. The objective of climate policies should be to provide an incentive, but not to raise money, as it is actually often the case. And to be honest, I'm a little bit worried because I hear more and more policymakers advocating for a shift from labor taxation to environmental taxation. And I think this idea is a bit wrong because first, it's not sustainable for public finance in the long term if we reach climate neutrality by 2050. And second, environmental taxation are much more regressive by nature usually than labor taxation. So to answer the question of Kevin, I would say that what we need is to shift from labor taxation to capital taxation to bring more redistribution and to finance the climate policies. And in parallel, we could have some environmental taxation to provide the right incentive and to try to take out of the market some of the products that are dangerous for the environment. So that would be my answer to this.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Would you like to go second with the
second
question?
Yeah. Yes, it is two. Well, two things. Social climate fund. Well, in my view, the best and the easiest path to ensure the climate fund, it's decouple the climate fund to the ETS2. Because like with the proposal of the Commission, well, it's a little bit blackmailing. Like we could have options to found a social climate fund. We could have options to found to have enough finance and resources to a big mechanism of compensation, that it's not coming everything from ETS2, that it's basically cars and households that are basically the most vulnerable and middle income class. This is my view. Like, I defend this. It will not fly, because we need all the member states and so on. But the problem we have it because we made this proposal. Because we could imagine other things in terms of social climate fund. First. Secondly, well, if we have that, we have this proposal, and then we have to deal with that. Politically, maybe in a blackboard, but politically it's extremely risky. Explain to all the people in Europe that they have like old houses and old cars, and they are not able to renew it, that they have to start to pay for like taxes. They have to pay taxes when they will want to adapt, and they don't have enough resources to do it. It's not possible to do it, in my view. For this reason, and I think it makes sense, like the Parliament thought, okay, we will start to doing this with cars coming from companies, private companies, and commercial buildings. That makes more sense, no? Because you have companies involved with these two things, no? And try to fight for additional finance coming from other funds. That it's not only this.
I think the one on the share profits should have gone to Diderik Samson, but in the absence of Diderik, I think maybe Stephanie would like to try.
Yeah, maybe one thought I have following this discussion is the dichotomy, I think, is not really just only about the cost of environmental policies and what public money can do. I mean, this, and Mr. Sanson has said it in the beginning, this transition will cost immensely. It's not just public money that can provide for this. It's and it's why at the with the State Secretary for the Economic Transition, we're also trying to leverage private money, be it from the enterprises which are willing to do their share, to the savings from the citizens. We implemented, for example, what we called pré-proxy. So in translation would be a proxy loan. Basically, when you see a local initiative about social or environmental transition, then that you're looking for some money, you're an entrepreneur and you're looking for some money, citizens in your neighborhood or in your circle of knowledge people, or anywhere, anyone actually in the Brussels capital region could lend you some money and be not taxed for that. And this is a very powerful, I think, pot of means which can be actually put to this transition to make it actually like more likely to happen, because it helps entrepreneurial projects on the ground, and it also takes into account, it uses the potential of the citizens in here. So it makes that connection between the project and the investor, which is who is a local investor, and it shares the burden kind of, and it puts it into a dynamic and positive trend, because this is entrepreneurial activity and it has a social or environmental impact.
Chiara, would you like to also comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on the last point about big corporation and households. And I think it's completely right to be frustrated, upset, and not seeing the justice element to it. But I think we should acknowledge that something is moving in calling big corporation accountable. And if you look outside the regulatory framework or what measures are put in place, there's a lot of work that's been going on at NGOs level or communities that are driving climate litigation against big corporation much more than in the past. And I'm not saying that this is the tool that will solve this unbalance in power between the individual and the households and the big corporation. But I think we're slowly seeing some time and some pressure exercised there with mechanisms that are put in place in regulation, mechanisms that are soft mechanisms, or looking at the taxonomy, trying to categorize good investments according to the quality of the companies. So there is something going on around the big problem, and so hopefully something will change in the future.
Okay, let's return to the question whether in the room. Robin, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. I learned a lot. I have one question, which is maybe a bit of a challenge of something. I understood basically broadly that environmental taxation is primarily regressive as it stands today, and it is the case in many ways. But why does it have to be? And that's really something that, you know, with a bit of a tax background, I'm always focusing on the design of policies can be regressive if it is designed as such, but it doesn't have to be. And typically, if we consider that one of the first priorities of transition is not only looking at different sectors, but also in general, it's about reducing our consumption as a whole. We could also have, you know, more, taxation basically with certain steps, right? Where, as I don't know, if you consume a certain amount of water, then you get taxed certain levels, and then at certain, once you take 3 baths in a week, then at some point you start reaching other households, and then you can tax them more with different brackets. So we don't really use the taxation potential that we could have, because we also don't necessarily look as much into the different design options that we have. And so I'm just wondering what you're feeling in your respective policy areas, what could be policy design options where you think, yeah, here we have actually concrete proposals that cannot be in a very just transition perspective, both fair and basically moving into the donuts kind of framework.
I think understood. Any more questions, Amandine? And then Martin?
Thank you very much to the four of you for your very stimulating insights. We heard Diederik Samson talk about technological industrial revolution, he said. But I'm wondering whether what we need is not rather a cultural revolution. Because in politics and in society, he talked about a new growth model. And then Stephanie talked about an alternative economic model. And something in my mind tells me that they're not talking about the same thing. And I see this as a major cleavage within or between political families that think of themselves as progressives, that they do not really see this, and there is this totem of growth, especially for the Social Democrats, perhaps Javi and Laszlo have something to say about that, that is a real intellectual obstacle to think about something else and what is coming in the future. And talking about industrial revolution, something that we haven't mentioned yet is that the recovery plan has coupled green policies with digitalization. So to the point where we have earmarking and conditionality for spending the funds on digitalization. Is there any scientific evidence that digital activities are greener than other activities? because I have my doubts there. And my suspicion is this was the big gift made to multinational corporations. So why this coupling between digitalization and green policies? And finally, perhaps to Stephanie and Javi and also Felix, I would be curious to know if from a bottom-up perspective at a local level and national level, how are the current European and EU instruments, initiatives perceived? The funds, but also the new rules, are they perceived as constraints, as opportunities? Is that even much debated? That's not quite clear. I mean, apart from the elaboration of the national recovery plans, it's not quite clear at this stage how all this is translating at a national and local level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's finish the round of questions with Martin, and then we will give back.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think there have been really good points raised. I mean, I really like Javi's focus on, middle class. Why do they have to pay? Then Stephanie's, suggested, or gave this example of the Brussels community. I've lived in various places, and there was the North Oxford Carbon Hub. Basically, people living in mansions, unwilling to refit their, introduce double glazing, well-off people. At the same time, these well-off people invested in North Carbon Hub, i.e., because it was a good investment, right? 7% return on local initiatives. I think there's something wrong here. So on the one hand, do we actually have to offer these good investments, which I think they can really deliver good things, whilst at the same time actually not daring to touch the issues of people who have wealth? One can have windfall profit taxes and stuff like that and go after the big capital, but isn't our main issue the big middle class, that we have difficulties of getting buy-in? And actually, these are wealthy people, if you put it in a global perspective. And they sit on, workers in some of these cities sit on property. I come from a working class background. I have no words for this. I don't feel for them, because they actually have millions in property. And why don't we touch that? And so, Javi, I'm not so sure whether I would fully follow you that, we couldn't do that. We have to do it, because otherwise we are lost.
Thank you so much. We have literally 2 minutes to each panelist. Please, target the question which you think is appealing to you most. You can also respond to 2, but then please be mindful about the limited time. I thank you very much for being focused. Felix would start.
Yes, on the taxation, whether environmental taxation can be progressive, I think it can be, but it has some problems because it's a very complex issue that depends a lot on the context of each people. For example, you could have a very poor household that live in a poorly isolated apartment, class G, and a very rich household that lives in a super big house, class A. And then how do you do to make that taxation more progressive? I think it's possible to some extent, but it's not. It's much harder than when you tax capital, for example, where it's much clearer, or when you tax labor as well. And also, it's a matter of political priority. I come from Belgium, and I'm completely astonished by this measure from the Belgian government to give a €100 voucher check to counter the energy price crisis to every household that has an energy contract. It means if you have 3 houses, 3 energy contracts, and you earn €200,000 a year, you get €300. And if you are a poor household, you get €100. So this is a matter of political priority as well. And on capital taxation, I come back to this because at European level, it's something that is completely absent from the discussions, to the point that the European Commission plans to reimburse Next Generation EU using the revenues coming from the emission trading system. And at some points there were some proposal to put in place a financial transaction tax, which would be much more progressive, and this is completely absent from the discussions. And I think here we as citizens have a duty to push for this, and even though every time people tell us that it's impossible due to the unanimity rule, that we need to put it on the debate and to push and push and push again, because I think at some point it will succeed, but I'm optimistic on this.
Thank you. Stephanie?
Yeah, a bit of a mixed response. On the are the EU instruments seen as an opportunity or as a challenge? I must say that the Brussels regional government has been set up in July 2019, and in the government agreement we had our own Green Deal before the European Commission. So we see it basically as a big opportunity. To link it with the taxation, I think we have to, I mean, at least speaking about the competences of my minister and what we can do with the legislation, we take the taxation problem in the other way around, looking at opportunities in the environmental regulation, meaning that with our portfolio, we don't have any means to control or to put fines on the economic actors, but we want to do the opposite way and to incentivize them to go into this transition. So that's why, and looking and going back at my first sentence about our Brussels Green Deal, we set up the target of 2030 as the moment where no more public money, no more regional public money would go into economic actors which are not into their transition, social and environmental. So it's about predictability for the economic actors. So we told them back in 2019, in 11 years, you're not going to be able to get any more social public money if you are not implementing socially and environmentally exemplary business model. And of course, our goal is that within these 11 years, all economic actors are actually doing their parts. But so this is, just to answer, this is another way of thinking about environmental taxation that can be designed, I mean, it's not taxation, it's incentives, but that can be designed to be more equally reported. And on the major intellectual cleavage, I fully agree. On the green and digital transitions, I always fight not to talk about twin transitions, because they are not twin transitions. Digital transformation can help to achieve the objectives of the Green Deal, but the reverse is not true. It's not true that well, the environmental goals cannot help to get to the digital transformation. So we should not talk about twin transitions, but green transition and digital transformation. And just last week, some consultancies in Belgium put out a big report saying how much digital technologies can help in the environmental transitions. But in the small chapter, the 4th chapter of their study, they said, yeah, the rebound effects can have an impact, but we don't have any information and we don't have evidence to show what's this impact. So it speaks for its word. And yeah, finally on your question on the capital taxation, I don't have a big answer, but just to say that on the illustrations I gave on the proxy loan, this is not targeted to have big returns on investment. The main target is to have a dynamic local economy, because we don't think that's I mean the problem of the basic capitalist problem is that it's not related to finance is not working for the real economy, and that's what we want to change.
Thank you. Adi?
Yep. Well, really interesting questions. First, growth. Well, this is a really big debate. Really big debate. In my view, in my personal view as a social democrat, like the challenge should be the couple growth of massive use of resources, but not reject growth as an idea. This is my point, because there are a lot of theories about this, no? Like this alternative model of economy could be like, okay, growth, it's not the answer. I think it's needed rethink about what it means growth, and like how we, we think about GDP or these kind of things. Like I really think about this. I really believe in this. But growth, a sustainable social and climate growth should be part of our goals, socioeconomic general goals, in my view. Rethinking the model, but taking into account that growth continues being one of the goals, the objectives. First. Secondly, this means talk about circular economy, no, and a lot of policies and theories that we could have with a circular economy and like minimize the use of resources, and we have a lot of instruments and policies to do that, no. Also, it has been mentioned progressive taxations. Like, I agree, completely agree. Like the problem about taxation is like taxation. We do it green taxation. We do it to use like the forces of the market, of the incentives and disincentives. This is the idea. For this reason, we tax, no. But we have like problems on that, and progressive taxation could be an answer. The point is like progressive taxation. It's not so easy with everything. And it's like to apply, and this is a reality. Like how it's perceived in national administrations or like local governments, like the European instruments. Well, basically now everybody, like in Europe at national level, is talking about the recovery plans and the money that will come from Brussels. Like this is an easy conversation. Like I think when we will pass the green legislation in a couple of years, it will be more difficult, like, to be honest. And like I defend completely like this program, the European Green Deal, and this we have to do it. About like they have to pay, like, like the question is like who have to pay? No, who? Like if like, and the mechanism that we do, because for example, like if basically we decide a mechanism, if you have bad windows, you pay 200 euros per year. Then like the centers of the big metropolitan areas, like the households, will be able easily to adapt, change the window, don't pay the tax, and then you will have all the peripheries of the working class paying 200 euros per year, and at the same time having the bad window. Well, I don't know if this is a proper design of a policy. And I know that the metropolitan areas of the big cities, even the working class of Europe, they are in like, if we compare with the rest of the world, like in a welfare situation. I know, but it's like, if the policy, it's designed properly to push climate change and like to have social justice. This is my point. I don't have doubts about like working class of metropolitan areas. They are, if you compare with the rest of the world, welfare. And this is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And finally, Chiara.
Thank you. I can't really comment on taxes. This is not my area, so I'll declare my limit. On growth, really interesting. And I think this is the point where the Green Deal is actually not that ambitious. And some of the rhetoric and narrative that we see in the Green Deal as an instrument is not going very far away from what we've seen in the narrative of sustainable development for 40 years. And that's where we get stuck, because we change the sustainable development narrative into green growth. The actual thinking is pretty much the same. So things about degrowth, the elephant in the room, using the GDP as a criteria. I mean, there's a lot of examples, academic work done on well-being indicators, work-life balance, social networks, quality of the environment, access to environment. This improves people's lives. And if you improve people's lives in this model of degrowth, you reduce inequalities. And those are the existing inequalities on which climate policy tap on. So it's a really kind of interconnected framework, and it's really ambitious. And I think there's a lot of push from a part of the ecological economists that are putting together some credible proposals into moving out of the GDP, and Éloi Laurent is one of those, if you're interested. So first question. Second question, digital impact. If you look at in the pandemic example, everyone was shocked by the reduction of emissions from aviation. We were not traveling, but we were on our laptops quite a lot, guys. And if you are on your laptop 12 hours a day compared to being in your office, the actual carbon footprint of your activities, I don't have the data because I don't have it in the hand, but it's not something that you should be disregard. So digitalization has an important environmental impact. And I agree they should not be put together, because actually digitalization doesn't necessarily help the ecological transition. There are two important transitions, and they help in other ways. So digitalization, for example, help participation. Because if people are more connected and they can access resources and they can access participatory platforms, then they engage more than being isolated. So they serve different purposes. And third, on your question, very difficult, but one idea has been put on the table many, many years ago and sometimes comes up: individual carbon budget. We have talked about the individual carbon budget. It's not a perfect model. It wouldn't solve necessarily the problem of power. So rich, powerful individuals and groups will remain rich and powerful, but the system would be nudging them to take into account their actions much more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it is my role to thank all the panelists and the keynote speaker who has already left, and the audience, which has been very active, and those who connected with online. Very often a moderator also needs to give a kind of summary, but I'm in a very lucky situation, because the summary has been prepared in a graphic way, and it will appear just in a few seconds also on the screen. If I can just highlight one aspect of the conclusion, I think especially in the last half hour, this discussion was indeed moving towards more and more fundamental questioning of the existing economic model, social model, taxation model, and indeed calling for if not immediate transformation, but indeed openness, at least to discuss radical shifts in how we run the economy, how we run our society, the public sector, and especially the private sector, connection between finance, but also the real economy, and how it is all together meant to serve our society in a sustainable fashion. I'm sure that ULB as well as FEPS, which have been organizing this panel, will continue. On behalf of FEPS, what I can say is that you find a few publications here, and you probably won't find any FEPS publication which doesn't have one way or another some connection with the question of the climate, the Green Deal, the just transition, or some element of this sequence. Let's not forget, oh wow, we have it now, but let's not forget what Diederik Samson also mentioned, that we have this terrible war, and the impact of the war on the situation of the climate, the energy transition, and also the social situation in Europe still needs to be studied, because we cannot ignore all these connections if we want to give the right response in the name of sustainability, which the father of the Beyond GDP philosophy, Enrico Giovannini, always highlights as sustainability in terms of economic, social, environmental, and also institutional one. Let's be aware of all these dimensions and challenges. Thanks so much again for coming, being so active and insightful, and sharing your experience with the audience today. See you next time.